Okay, now that you've run all your boards through the joiner, you're going to lay them out. You'll find that you have two that are longer, two that are shorter. These ones are your 48.5 inches. These are going to be 47.5. Your legs are going to have to be cut out of one of the 48.5 inch pieces. So set these aside for a minute. You're going to look at them and see which looks cleaner for the legs. This one's got a couple knots in it here, a little more than this one does, so I'm going to use this one for my legs. I'm going to mark 24 on each end, so I know that I need to cut this each piece to 24, and then there will be a little left over. But I'll set my miter gauge to 24 on the chop saw. Next, out of one of the shorter pieces, we're going to cut 2/16 and a 12. On this one, I'm going to cut my 2/16 out of this end because the 16s are my tabletop, and this one has some scab on the end, and you don't want that in your tabletop. It can go on the 12-inch piece will be your apron, and it doesn't really matter if there's scab on the apron. So I've marked 16 for here, 16 for the middle, and then I want this end to be my 12-inch piece. So I mark that so that when I take it over to the chop saw, I'll remember what I'm doing. I'm going to grab my next short piece, and I'm going to cut 3 12s out of this one. It doesn't really matter, so I'll just mark 12s. And I'll go ahead and mark it 3 times just so I remember that this one I am cutting 3 12s out of. And then my longer piece, I'm going to cut 3/16 out of this one. Again, I'm going to mark it 3 times so I remember. And now we're going to take it over to the chop saw. Okay, so we finished cutting all of our pieces on the chop saw. You should have 5 16-inch pieces, 4 12-inch pieces, and 2 24-inch pieces. If you don't, then you need to go find another 2x4, and we need to make some new cuts. So I'm going to set aside the 24-inch and the 12-inch pieces. And I'm just going to work on the 16-inch pieces because those are our tabletop. And I want to get these cut first and gluing so that the glue has time to set and we can go work on other things. So I'm going to lay them out as close to straight as possible, and then I'm going to take a pencil and I'm going to run a line all the way across them on one end. And once I'm doing this so that once I have them cut, I can flip them end for end and we can vary how they're laid out. So I'm going to divide this into thirds, which comes out to about 1 inch. So I'm going to set my fence at about 1 inch, and I'm going to run all 5 through, and then I'm going to grab the larger piece, and I'm going to run each of those larger pieces through again. Another thing is make sure you have a push stick near you because this is really thin to run your fingers through. Okay, so you've finished cutting your pieces on the table saw. You should have pieces that are about 1 inch wide. You're going to grab a couple bar clamps or pipe clamps, and you're going to grab a piece of cardboard to put underneath it because we're getting it ready to glue. If you don't put cardboard underneath it, you may spend a lot of time at the end of the year chipping glue off the tables, which is not a fun job. So you're going to lay them out with that line that we made earlier all on one end, and then once you get them laid out, you're going to flip each piece, every other piece. So you've got a line here, you're going to flip this one so the line is on this side. And just do every other one. And then we're going to go ahead and dry clamp this just to make sure that there are no gaps, because sometimes even when we flipped them, the pieces may be tapered and you may have to readjust a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and dry clamp it together and look for any gaps. Another thing is make sure these edges are fairly straight. It'll save you work later on. So you're going to get above it and look down and see if you see any gaps in between each of the pieces. And once you've got it tight, flip it up to make sure the back side there's not any huge gaps. It looks pretty good, so I'm going to loosen these and I'm going to go ahead and start the gluing process. Another thing is these clamps are actually tipped in just a little bit, so they put more pressure on the top edges of the board, which can cause the whole board to kind of bow in. So I put a jam board that comes up just a little past half the thickness of these boards in, so that it takes care of that problem. Another thing to be aware of is make sure you grab the same type of clamps. When you go to glue this, you don't want one bar clamp and one pipe clamp because the height will be different and it can twist your board and cause problems when you try to run it through the planer. Another thing is once you have glued it, make sure you wipe off the excess glue on the top once you get it tight so that you don't have a bunch of puddles on top, because that again will cause problems when you run it through the planer. And then you also want to get down low and look at the line at the bottom and make sure you don't have a bunch of gaps, because sometimes the boards have a tendency to pop up, and if they do, you want to just take your mallet and hit those boards that do. Another thing is you want to make sure that this edge here is straight when you glue it, because if it's not, it ends up causing problems later on in the project and just makes it more difficult for you in the long run. So now that I've flipped it over and we've cleaned off the glue, this is the gap I was talking about, making sure there's no space in between here and your wood, and that's what you would adjust with the mallet. This one looks pretty good. There's no space, so I think I'm going to leave it. The other thing is you want to stay by your project once you've finished gluing. You want to hang out for at least 3 or 4 minutes because as the glue dries, the boards can shift, and where you had no gaps here, sometimes they can pop up or down and you want to be able to readjust that. So it's important that you hang out by your project for a little bit. Another thing to be aware of is you might see some gaps in between the boards that we just glued. Don't be worried about that. We're going to end up planing it down, and whatever does not go away with planing, we're going to end up filling later on, so it's not a big deal.